Today's verse, I pray that this will show you that your obedience and worship to God needs to be full. It cannot be half, it cannot be partial. You need to fully commit to God, and there's no excuse for that because as we're going to read in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 20 to 23, there is a man who partially obeyed God, and the consequences for him was severe. And that man is King Saul, the first king of Israel. Just to give you a little bit of context, Israel at this time is asking God for a king. They've been getting too tired of the judges system, and so they forced God into granting them a king. And so God actually gives into this request. And you also have Samuel as the prophet that presides over Israel. And Saul is the one that is picked for the king of Israel. Now, at first, Saul had a pretty good start. Like, he was filled with the Spirit of God. He listened to God's commands at first. He was chosen from the smallest tribe of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. And so God chose the least likely person to be king. But then his status of being king got over. He started to become jealous of other nations. He started to become greedy and take things for himself and not give glory to God. And so we see in this really final chance that Saul has to obey God, God commands Saul in verse 3 to strike the Amalekites, an idolatrous nation, to destroy their king, King Agag, and to put to death all the animals, the cattle, basically everyone there. But this is what Saul says. Saul actually spares the king of Amalek, and he spares the cattle, and then poses it as he's sacrificing burnt offerings to God. But but Samuel comes and confronts Saul, and this is how Saul responds in verse 20. Then Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of Yahweh, and went on the way on which Yahweh sent me, and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. Verse 21, but the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to Yahweh your God at Gilgal. Verse 22, and Samuel said, has Yahweh as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Verse 23, for rebellion is the sin of divination, and insubordination is as wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king. Some harsh words of judgment we read in this passage, but what do we see in this passage? We see that Saul tries to make an excuse and cover up his disobedience to God. He says, I did obey God. I obeyed him. He told me to, I brought King Agag back to be executed, and also I've given the animals for burnt offerings. Now, there are two things that we see here that I learned from this passage. One is that partial obedience to God is still disobedience. If you are trying to go halfway or be in the middle, or the term we use in Christianity is lukewarm, not being on fire for God, but also not being refreshing for God. You're lukewarm in the middle between God and the world. That is still disobedience. You either need to be fully for God or you are against God. There is no neutral side. And then the second thing we see here, and you kind of see it more as you go on into this passage, we see that Saul is saying, he took some of these sheep and oxen and is putting it for burnt sacrifice and offerings, thinking that God is going to be pleased by this. But this response that Samuel gives Saul is something that Saul didn't even expect at all. And we see the most important phrase, I think, in this, which is in verse 22, as Samuel says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. The meaning that Samuel is trying to give is that God prefers your obedience over your ritual lifestyle to him. The point of the Old Testament system was to ultimately obey God, to point people to God, to give thanks to God, to remember God through the different festivals that the book of Leviticus highlights. But what Saul is doing here is the exact opposite of what God was intending the sacrifice system to be for. The purpose of the sacrifice system was to obey God in the end. But this is not what Saul does. And so we see that if we are just living a legalistic lifestyle just to do the checklist and say that we've done it, we actually didn't do anything at all because the desire is not there. Your heart is not towards God. And that is why in verse 23, we ultimately see that Saul's sin, him sacrificing to God, is actually insubordination. He is going against God. He is actually turning to idolatry. And because he rejected God, God has rejected him. And the third thing I want to say is that when you reject God, there is going to be a point of time where God is going to reject you. You continue to keep blaspheming and rejecting and suppressing God, the truth of God, God is going to reject you as well. God does not play into human beings' games, and definitely games we have played against God through our sin. God is a just God, and he has the right to make anyone king or to not make anyone king. And that's why God ultimately chooses King David, a man after God's own heart, because the desire God had was not for someone to get all the glory for himself. The desire was for a king to ultimately give all the glory to God. I hope this video blessed you, and I pray that this will encourage you to look at the things that you have done in your life and ask yourselves, is this me trying to obey God, or is this me trying to do things for myself and for my own greed and for my own selfishness? On that note, take care and God bless.